It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a native of Ocala, and like many of you, whether you're native or new to the area, I think grateful that we have Fort King. That Second Seminole War that started with the attack on the soldiers who were coming up from Tampa. Whenever I'm in downtown Tampa, the soldiers started from Fort Brooke, which is now paved over, and there's a historical monument, and that's all. But if you come here, where they were headed, we obviously have this resource in Ocala, and where the actual attack took place in the battle, you can stop halfway between here and Tampa and see that. But like most places, so much of history is paved over, so we're really lucky to have this site that's been preserved. And I'm honored to be here with the part of the 250th birthday of the country, and the topic that we talked about me doing is Manifest Destiny and the country expanding in the 1800s, going from the 13 states to, by the end of the 1800s, becoming an imperial power. So I'm going to talk about that, obviously, tonight, but as I prepared for this, and I guess some people, maybe a lot of us, as the 250th birthday approaches, may have some ambivalence because it's wonderful to have this big birthday coming, but whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, we're in a divisive time in our nation's history. Although when we've had these big birthdays, that's not been unusual. 1826, the era of good feelings had just ended. James Monroe had been elected, and in 1820, and other than George Washington, the only time nobody ran against the candidate. But 1824, the contested election, so the 50th anniversary of the country, John Quincy Adams was president, but he had been basically elected by the House of Representatives and lost the popular vote. 1876, the 100th anniversary, the end of Reconstruction, so the country's still healing from the Civil War. 1926, not as bad. Things, the Great Depression was still on the horizon. But in 1976, the country's still getting over Watergate. So, but as I prepared for this, I just got to thinking that we can take heart that the divisiveness is not anything new. The country has had issues before. We always will. We're human beings. And as I'll talk about Manifest Destiny, but some things that happened in the past that we see echoes of today. And of course, we all know that saying, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. I'll use Mark Twain quote later in the evening, but his way of saying that, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. So same things don't happen again, but certain patterns do recur. And this quote, again, most of us know Ben Franklin, as the Constitutional Convention was meeting in Philadelphia in secret. I don't know how that could happen today, but they really met in secret and didn't tell anybody what they were doing. But one woman asked Ben Franklin after the proceedings one day, "What kind of government are you giving us?" And he very famously replied, "A republic if you can keep it." And once again, I'm sure there are times, whatever end of the political world you're in, you may pull your hair out and say, "Are we really keeping it?" But Ben Franklin, the debates over the Declaration, the Constitution were real. There were Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Not everybody favored the Constitution as it was written. So just something to think about as we move forward. But the 1800s is a time of mass expansion for the United States. John L. O'Sullivan, a newspaper editor, a magazine editor, is credited with giving us that term, which still resonates with many people. He was the editor of this magazine on your right, United States Magazine and Democratic Review. So he published that from 1837 to 1859. It really supported the Democratic Party and was against the Whig Party, which was starting to fade at this point in American history. He first used the term manifest destiny in 1845, and many of us have seen that quote or something like it. So basically saying it's the destiny of the United States, the God-given right of the United States to take over the continent. In 1839, he didn't use the exact terminology, but he did talk about the future of the United States and said we had a duty to establish moral dignity and the salvation of man. So he had high hopes for the United States, moral dignity and the salvation of man. He comes up with that phrase, but he's not the only one who's thinking about that. For the 100th anniversary of the country, Walt Whitman revised one of his poems. I guess I could picture Donald Trump reading this poem to get the idea of making Canada a state, but Walt Whitman in 1876 was thinking of a time when Cuba and Canada would be part of the United States. Not all Americans had that vision, but a lot did. In the early 1800s. Obviously, Native Americans, weren't happy with the expansion of the United States. But I would say in the early 1800s, it was kind of an expectation of many Americans that we were going to continue to expand. I don't have a picture of John Quincy Adams, but he, Secretary of State, President, diplomat, son of our second president, talked and wrote a lot in the early 1800s about the United States expanding, including possibly to Cuba and the Yucatan Peninsula. But he's a good example of some of the disagreements that come later. As he lived longer and started to realize expansion of the United States also meant an expansion of slavery, he was not quite as fond of the idea. And again, that's a pattern we'll see in the 1800s. As the country grows, more people and more division about what exactly it meant to be an American, and maybe just have that moral dignity and the salvation of man that John O'Sullivan talked about. Different people have different ideas of what that might have meant. Many of us are familiar with this famous painting from 1872, which was titled American Progress. And so for many, this is a visible representation of manifest destiny. A woman representing the United States floating through the air, an angelic type figure, coming east to west. So there's light in the east and darkness in the west. So civilization is coming. She's got the telegraph wire in one hand, a book in the other hand to represent education. And settlers are coming, miners are coming, the railroads are starting to come, and animals, the buffalo and Native Americans, not looking at this very positively. So at least he understood that this is not necessarily a good thing for everybody. The map of the United States is going to change drastically in the 1800s. I always like to remind my students, 250 years ago, this was the United States. This little pocket of 13 states tucked up on the Atlantic Ocean, many of the states not even as large as they end up being. Most of them, in fact, or maybe half. So North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. So not very large. But by the end of the 1800s, will be continent-wide and outside of the continent itself. And the growth happens in spurts. The French and Indian War is going to lead to really the first great expansion. So France and Great Britain have a world war. So in world history books, it's the 7 Years' War. And our American history books tends to be the French and Indian War. The French, for the most part, had the Native Americans on their side. Not always, but in all these battles, people had to pick sides. And so the Native Americans sided with the French, who ended up losing the war. The French, had kind of snuck into what is today Canada, got into the Mississippi River and come down the Mississippi, never large in numbers, but they had a good number of traders who were working with the Native Americans. England is going to win this war and basically evict France from the mainland of North America. Florida at that point, still part of the Spanish Empire, leading up to the French and Indian War. Spain makes a bad decision in that war. Spain, late in the war, decides that France might actually win. So they jump in on the side of France, and suddenly France has lost the war, and Great Britain, to punish Spain, invades Havana, Cuba. And Spain didn't want to give up Havana, Cuba. And so they traded Florida basically to get it back. So all of Florida traded for Havana. And so 1760, and Florida, think again, a lot of you know this, Florida was not, it's hard to imagine today, Florida was not really popular back then. So nobody really particularly wanted us too badly. So Florida, part of Spain until 1763, and then to Great Britain for a 20-year period. After the American Revolution, Spain is going to reacquire Florida. I know last week's speaker talked about that a bit. So 20 years under British control, and then Florida's back under Spanish control in 1783. And more importantly for the United States, all the way to the Mississippi River, except for what was Florida. So the country expands quite a bit after the Revolution. Now, Manifest Destiny really runs from early 1800s to the late 1800s. Louisiana Purchase to the Spanish-American War. So by the early 1800s, the Spanish controlled much of the heartland of what is today the United States, but had secretly sold that to France in 1800. And in 1802, that was made public, that France had reacquired the interior of what is today the United States. Napoleon Bonaparte is the ruler of France at that point. He intends to reestablish the French Empire in the New World. What is today Haiti, back then it was Saint-Domingue, French colony, which was incredibly wealthy with sugar plantations. And Saint-Domingue had a slave revolt in the 1790s. Napoleon sends his army to the island to try and reclaim it. And his plan was to take it back over, make a lot of money on that sugar production, and then also send an army to what is today the United States. Thomas Jefferson is president. He is not really fond of any of this. He doesn't want to have a French army and French control in the heartland of the United States. And especially with the fact that the French controlled New Orleans. So the United States has access to the Mississippi River, but trying to trade through New Orleans was becoming problematic. What if France actually sends an army, and what if they seal off the Mississippi? And so Thomas Jefferson, at one level, is preparing for war. What if the French send an army? We better be prepared to fight. But Thomas Jefferson had spent time in France. He had French friends, and several of them said, why don't you try and talk to Napoleon and maybe try and purchase New Orleans and access to New Orleans. And that is what he will do. And he sends a representative to, several representatives to France with authorization to pay up to $10 million for New Orleans. And the representatives are shocked when the French negotiators say Napoleon's willing to sell you the whole colony, which is going to be the Louisiana Territory. He'll sell the whole thing. And they negotiate a price of $15 million. And I was thinking today, the negotiators back then, I mean, you had to trust them a lot. And they just, you couldn't call back home and ask, hey, is this okay? So you really were out on a limb. You had to have a lot of trust put in you, and then you just didn't know. So they, of course, made a guess that Thomas Jefferson would say, absolutely yes. We'll take all that for $15 million if we were going to pay $10 million just for New Orleans. Napoleon's brothers are furious with this. The very famous scene, Napoleon liked warm, scented baths. You can, maybe that's not an image we need of Napoleon in a bathtub, but he liked to take long baths, and his brothers, Joseph and Lucian, came to see him in his bath, and he told them what he was doing, and they were furious and yelling at him, you can't sell this. And he told them he was going to sell it, and they threatened to try and stop it. And he got up, he stood up, and then he purposely splashed them, fell back down in the water and splashed them. And then, of course, he just said, I'm going to do what I want because I'm in charge. But that is when the United States acquires what we know as the Louisiana Territory, which is one of the best land deals probably that you could have. 828,000 square miles, around 3 to 4 cents an acre, almost 25% of what will eventually be the lower 48 states. So a huge chunk of territory that President Jefferson does without immediate congressional approval. So this is one of those things, as I was preparing for this, that I thought, here's a echo of modern times. Presidents kind of doing what they want. And it's ironic, many of you know Thomas Jefferson. He helped write the Constitution. He favors the Constitution. Pre-President Thomas Jefferson probably would have said, a president can't do this. President on his own can't go buy a huge amount of land from another country. But when he's president, he basically, talking to his advisors, and said, we better do this before Napoleon changes his mind. And Thomas Jefferson will later say, I stretched the Constitution until it almost broke. So again, if you look around the world today and say, is our Constitution going to hang in there? Our third president admitted, saying, I'm stretching it to its limits. And Congress eventually approved this, but it was not something that they had given prior approval to. And if you're ever in St. Louis, this was eventually ratified by Congress, and this went forward. But 1804, what was known as Three Flags Day. All the countries had already agreed to this. But in St. Louis, officially, March 9th and 10th, 1804, there was a ceremony. The Spanish, even though they'd technically given up this land before, they insisted on flying their flag and lowering it. And then France put up their flag and lowered it. And then the United States put up its flag. So Three Flags Day in St. Louis, it's something people are aware of, but most of the rest of the country, it's kind of a minor footnote. So a little bit about Florida and all these things. Just a reminder, once upon a time, Florida went all the way to New Orleans. And that's still the case after the Louisiana Purchase. So the Spanish still control Florida, which reaches all the way to New Orleans. There is confusion, there's debate in the years after the Louisiana Purchase. The United States says this was part of the purchase. Spain says no, it's not. This is a modern day map of Louisiana. These are the parishes or the counties of Louisiana that are east of the Mississippi River. They are known today as the Florida parishes because they were part of Spanish Florida. But eventually they become part of what is called the Republic of West Florida. So Florida history and this period between the Louisiana Purchase and when Florida as a whole officially becomes part of the United States, both East and West Florida had short-lived republics where they broke away and established their own governments. The Republic of West Florida, their uprising were these parishes there in Louisiana. So that happened in 1810. Most of the people living there by then were American citizens who'd migrated in. Spanish are very weak. Their empire is very fragile, so they can't really do much about it. And long story short, these American citizens have moved in and they decide to have a rebellion and try and have the United States annex them. So they established a capital on the Mississippi River. They asked for President Madison to annex them. He wants to do that. Congress is not in session. They had their own flag. So they went all out and had their own flag as well. So President Madison does, he also moves forward with annexation without congressional approval. And so the United States will take over, this is only like 2.5 months the Republic is actually there. The Spanish will always claim that this was never valid. The United States had no right to try and annex. But a little interesting tidbit of Florida history, that part of what is today Louisiana had broken off. East Florida is going to have a similar situation, and they're going to have their own flag. The Republic of East Florida in 1812 has an uprising, which mainly was triggered by people from Georgia. So if you're a Gator, you know what's going on here. So Georgians are going to come down and try and start trouble. Although President Madison secretly gives a general, George Matthews, authority to go down to St. Augustine and talk to the Spanish governor and try and negotiate transfer of East Florida to the United States. The Spanish don't really want any part of that. But General Matthews and another Georgian named Harrison Buckner, they basically, they try and they do build up an army. They establish themselves in St. Mary's, right across the Florida border or the Spanish border. The areas there in St. Mary's and Fernandina Beach were actually pretty prosperous. So they couldn't find actual residents who wanted an uprising. So they got backwoodsmen and hunters and so forth from Georgia who were willing to come down and fight. And they marched on St. Augustine. They're not able to take it over, but they are trying to take it over and then ask the United States to annex them. This is in 1812. The United States is getting close to war with Great Britain, the War of 1812. So President Madison will pull the plug on this because he realizes if we go to war with Great Britain, he doesn't want to be at war with Spain at the same time. And so he lets General Matthews know that basically not to continue, and then he denies, President Madison denies any involvement, one of those situations. And one of those what ifs in history. So General Matthews is furious. He's been sent down with a direct secret message from the president to annex East Florida. He's now been told don't do it. And the president is denying knowing anything about it. And Matthews says, I'm going to Washington and blow them all up. I'm just going to go and face the president and make sure everybody knows what happened. But he gets malaria on the way. He gets to Augusta, Georgia, gets very sick and passes away. So he never makes it to Washington, D.C., but he was ready to go and defend himself and say that he'd been hung out to dry. So this was the Republic of East Florida flag. Their motto, the safety of the people, the supreme law. So these are failed, this is a failed attempt to be annexed by Spain. But eventually Florida will become part of the United States. So John Quincy Adams will help negotiate the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819. Spain Spain, once again, is fragile. The border is porous. The United States is already has settlers flocking in. So Spain will eventually agree to sell the United States Florida. 1821 is when the actual handover occurs, but the treaty is signed in 1819. And in 1845, Florida will actually become a state. So we have a long territorial period, 1821 to 1845. The first governor of Florida, when Florida becomes a state, William Moseley, some citizens sent this flag to him and he hung it up on the day he was inaugurated. So this was never officially Florida's flag, but this was the first state flag that we had. Which I don't know, we might, if you're tired of other people moving and want to stop people coming here, this might be one to hang up at the state border again. It was controversial, so it never became the official flag, but it did hang on the day of the governor's inauguration. John Quincy Adams, on your right, he is Secretary of State for President James Monroe, the 1820s. Now Florida is part of the United States as a territory. Spain is crumbling. Its New World dynasty is crumbling. So all the money that had come out of the New World, all the silver and gold that had made Spain fabulously wealthy back in the 1500s, they are now falling apart. And so many of their colonies in South America and Central America start breaking away. European nations look at a place like Mexico or Colombia or Peru and say these are now fair game. If Spain has lost those colonies, might we come in if we're France or the Netherlands or England? And the United States, with the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s, says what? You are not welcome here. European powers, you are not welcome in this hemisphere. And the United States in the 1820s probably couldn't have done anything about it. And I'm sure some European leaders just laughed. Like, who does the United States think they are to tell us we can't come? Now, they really didn't come for the most part. But it's certainly the United States flexing its muscles and saying, hey, this is what we plan to do in the future. The next great expansion is going to happen under President James Polk, who serves from 1845 to 1849. President Polk is a one-term president. He promised to serve one term, and he served one term. He is a politician from Tennessee, a Democrat in the vein of Andrew Jackson, and he has the dubious distinction of other than a president who's been assassinated, the youngest president ever to pass away. When he leaves office in 1849, he dies 103 days later. He gets sick and he dies. So he has the shortest post-presidency of any American president. And he was only 53 years old when he passed away. So, but he is very, very consequential in American history. The United States will acquire huge amount of land in these 4 years. More land than the United States had with the original 13 states, more land than the 828 million square miles of the Louisiana Purchase. So he will be determined when he takes office to try and expand the country, and he will do that. He also, I always point out too, some of you have heard me say this other places. I think I'm an animal person, and I like pets. I'm not sure one of our current problems is that we don't have like animal lovers in the White House lately. There are two presidents in American history who didn't have a pet. James Polk, and Donald Trump. And President Trump, kind of true to himself, he just says, I don't like animals. I'm not going to get an animal just to play the political game. And now President Biden had some dogs, but they kept biting everybody. So I'm not sure if you're an animal person, I think Commander was the one dog that kept biting the Secret Service agent. So I'm guessing he was playing politics, I'll get a dog, but then his dog kept biting everybody. So President Polk, he also, didn't have animals. Other presidents, the Teddy Roosevelt White House was like a zoo. Horses, his kids would bring horses inside. Well, again, President Polk is very consequential with Texas, with Oregon, and then the war with Mexico. There had been a long-standing dispute with Great Britain over the Oregon Territory. Previous President John Tyler had tried to settle this, and the British would not agree on this. President Tyler had suggested the 49th parallel. The extreme British claim is down here, deep into what is today Oregon. Some Americans claimed all the way up to this spot, which was actually on the border of Russia. And you can see why the British were not happy with this at all. If they had given up all that land, then they would not have had any land on the Pacific Ocean at all. So President Tyler, when he takes office, he threatens war with Great Britain. And eventually he is able to get them to agree to the 49th parallel. There was a slogan back then, 54-40 or fight. So there were those who said go for 54-40 or we're going to go to war. And President Polk, he wasn't all for that, but he did kind of act like he was willing to go to war. And the British back off and they finally agree on what is the current border, the 49th parallel. Maybe more importantly, there was the eventual annexation of Texas. Texas had broken away from Mexico in 1836. Mexico had made a strategic error in the years leading up to this rupture in 1836. This part of Mexico was very sparsely populated, a lot of Native American attacks. And so the Mexicans decided maybe we could have American settlers come in and they will help provide a militia to help fight Native Americans, and this will be a good thing. And people like Stephen F. Austin and his father, Stephen F. Austin, the father of Texas, he was what was known as an impresario. He basically worked with the Mexican government to get land and recruit settlers to come in. And Americans came in droves. And before the Mexicans knew it, they were outnumbered by American immigrants. And the American immigrants had to follow some basic rules. You had to report to the authorities if you came into Mexico. You had to convert to Roman Catholicism. You had to learn Spanish. You had to eventually give up your slaves when Mexico abolished slavery. And most of the immigrants from the United States were not interested in learning Spanish or converting to Catholicism other than just pretending to. And most of them were slave owners. And so they more or less skirted these rules. And eventually, being outnumbered, the local Mexican population found that these new settlers wanted to break away and be annexed by the United States. So 1836, that's when independence was declared, and the Alamo, we have George Matthews, we have East and West Florida and the chaos there, but Texas has the Alamo. So that valiant effort that so many people were killed by the Mexicans, but Texas does break away in 1836. but there was not a huge demand in the United States to annex Texas. So Texas for 9 years was an independent country. And so this is a marketing campaign that's still very popular in Texas. It's marketing, but it's also very true. So for 9 years, there was an independent Texas Republic. So Mexico did not acknowledge it, but the United States did. But it was not until 1845 when President Polk was in office where the United States was able to actually get the political power in Congress to actually annex Texas. So under President Polk, now pretty early in his time in office, Oregon is solidified, the Northwest, and now Texas becomes a state. And then, of course, the big one, the war with Mexico. So let's see. This goes back to debated territory with Texas, then the border between Texas and the United States. So once Texas becomes part of the United States says, well, the border is the Rio Grande. The Nueces River is up here, which had historically been the border between Mexico and the United States. So Mexico says, you know, we don't really want to, we don't want to have lost Texas, but even if we did, we still control this area in gray. The United States said, no, you don't, that's ours. And future President Zachary Taylor is sent down to the border and he builds a fort under President Polk's direction, basically right across the Rio Grande from Mexican troops. And then fighting starts breaking out. And President Polk is able to tell the United States that Mexico has invaded and attacked us. So make of that what you will. We will declare war on Mexico and really swamp Mexico pretty handily. So Mexico will lose about a third of its territory after the war with the United States. So all this comes into the United States under President Polk. So again, more land than the Louisiana Purchase and more land than the United States had had in 1776. So all that comes into the country under President Polk's watch. Another good land deal in 1867, Alaska. The United States pays $7.2 million for Alaska. This one we actually paid for. The earlier purchases, Louisiana and the money that was paid for Florida, a lot of times we didn't even pay the full amount. Like Louisiana Purchase, a quarter of that was not actually paid to France, but we just took on debt that American citizens said that France owed them. Here we actually wrote a check, so that's in the National Archives, like the canceled check. You know that we wrote a check to Russia for $7.2 million. Not all Americans were quite sure what to make of that. So that's a cartoon showing the new senators from Alaska, one penguin and one Eskimo, who are coming to Washington.
Seward's Folly.
And then William Seward, who, here's a cartoon. Alaska was known as Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. Not all Americans were sure, why are we buying a bunch of ice and a bunch of penguins, but a lot of natural resources there, so certainly this is something Russia regrets selling. But this is William Seward. He's looking at the Danish West Indies. So the United States starting to look a little bit farther away now. Now at least Alaska is still on the mainland of the United States, but this is now the first time we have property or land that's separated by another territory. So this is a country that's growing and changing some of the reasons that we do things. All right, so I'll let you read that. So everything so far, kind of standard American history, buying land and Once again, Native Americans throughout this whole process would have said, what's going on? None of this should be happening. But there are some failures to expand the country as well. So I give you that quote from John Adams. He was our first vice president. He learned very quickly that the vice presidency of the United States is basically a job with no duties. Basically, you're just there to kind of wait in case the president passes away, in case the president resigns, or somehow incapacitated. So John Adams realized that. Other vice presidents have said it more pithily. This is probably the most famous quote from John Garner. This one is my favorite, from Thomas Marshall. So whoever the vice president is, have a good thought for them, because, and I know in recent decades, presidents have generally tried to give vice presidents jobs so they have something like they're in charge of, but ultimately they're just kind of around and you don't see them much. I guess it's not the worst job to have, and it is an important job in case, and it is, these days it is often a stepping stone to the presidency. That wasn't always the case. Teddy Roosevelt, as many of you know, when he became vice president, he just said, my political career is over, because back then vice president really was a dead end. So he was a young man, but he said, this will be the end of my presidency, or hopes for like future presidency. But William McKinley was assassinated and things changed. So Aaron Burr was vice president for Thomas Jefferson, one of the more intriguing figures in American history. People love him or hate him. Alexander Hamilton didn't like him much. Thomas Jefferson, his president, didn't like him much. So these were the good old days. And one of those things that, as bright as they were, that you kind of wonder how they hadn't really puzzled this out, the writers of the Constitution. But those early elections, you didn't have a president and vice president running like on the same ticket. And so the election of 1800, everybody knew Thomas Jefferson was running for president, Aaron Burr was running for vice president. But when all the votes were cast, they had the same number of votes, which means that election gets kicked into the House of Representatives, which would have been a good time for Aaron Burr to come out and make very clear, hey, I'm the vice president. Well, he just keeps quiet. And now some historians will defend him, and others say he was basically trying to steal the presidency. So Thomas Jefferson never forgives him. He's just furious with him. So he's vice president, but they are not close, and he really has no real impact on what goes on, to the point that he's replaced. Jefferson will say to him, I'm going to run for re-election. I don't want you to be vice president. So he asks him to resign and replaces him in 1804, which he then ran for governor of New York and lost. Felt Alexander Hamilton had been a part of his defeat, and then that ensued the duel that led to Hamilton's demise. But then after that, he's looking for something to do, and he decides that he wants to try and perhaps break off part of the Louisiana Purchase and maybe part of Mexico for himself. So it's kind of an indirect form of manifest destiny. Now his supporters say he gets a bad rap about this, but it does seem like he's up to no good. He goes out west, he gets an army together. He has an ally, General James Wilkinson, who is in on this. And basically, now Aaron Burr will always say, I was just going to go get some land, and yeah, I was going to have settlers, and we were going to be armed, because we didn't know if Spain would attack the United States, so we were just going to be ready for that. But he had written a letter to General Wilkinson, the cipher letter. It was written in code, and it basically talked about maybe we can literally break off part of this territory and have it for ourselves and establish our own little kingdom here. General Wilkinson realizes this is not going to turn out well, so he ends up ratting out Aaron Burr to Thomas Jefferson. He writes Jefferson a letter and says, here's what Aaron Burr is up to. So something else that happens in the world today, we might say that wouldn't have happened in the past, is a president who goes after his political enemies through the courts. Well, Thomas Jefferson goes after Aaron Burr. He has him arrested numerous times on charges of treason. Not indicted, he just says go arrest him. 4 times total. Usually Aaron Burr turns himself in. He reads in the paper that he's being accused of treason. He'll go to the authorities, turn himself in. The authorities say there's no proof, so they let him go. The third time that happens, he actually did have men. He was coming down the Mississippi River with the intent of getting some land for himself somewhere out in this area. It was a ragtag band. It was not, they probably weren't going to be very successful, but he reads in the newspaper that he's wanted again. So he turns himself in. He's released. But then a few days later, he reads again. Thomas Jefferson is demanding that he be arrested. So that time he tries to escape. So he's a wanted man, and where else is somebody going to go? Where's he heading? He's going to go to Florida. And he's captured. He's captured in what is today Mississippi. And he is put on trial. He was put on trial for treason. But he's found not guilty. Thomas Jefferson was just furious. And it became a bit of a joke. So the main piece of evidence was the letter that he had written in code to General Wilkinson. At court, General Wilkinson has a letter that's not written in code. Well, it turns out the letter that is in court, General Wilkinson had written in his own hand. So this is a letter that Aaron Burr had supposedly written to him. So the court says, well, where's the actual letter? Well, I destroyed it, but I just wrote it down from memory. And of course, most historians believe he cut out pieces that implicated him. So he became a bit of a laughingstock. And then Aaron Burr, to President Jefferson's great frustration, was found not guilty of treason. The U.S. Constitution had laid out, if to be found guilty of treason, you either had to confess or you had to have 2 concrete witnesses come out and say you did it. And Aaron Burr didn't confess in court, and there weren't 2 witnesses, so he was found not guilty. John Marshall, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, oversaw the trial, and Jefferson was furious with the Supreme Court. So again, a president and Supreme Court butting heads. So that was a failure. Another failure, William Walker from Tennessee. He was a young man. He was born in 1824. He was an abolitionist. His family didn't own slaves, but as he got older, he felt like the Southern economy relied on slavery. He was one of a number of what were called filibusters. Today, that word filibuster means I'm going to get up in Congress and speak for hours and hold up legislation. In the 1800s, a filibuster was someone, usually an American citizen, but not always, somebody who actually tried to raise an army and go down to Central America and take over land and force it to be part of the United States. So he doesn't look like a military figure, and he really wasn't, but he is going to have the idea first in Mexico and then in Nicaragua to actually get troops and go down and try and take over those territories. The first one he does was in California, and show you a lot of flags. People always have to have their flag. So Sonora, the Sonoran area of Mexico, he asked the Mexican government for permission to start a colony. They said no. So he went and tried to take it over, and this was his flag for the Republic of Sonora. He's chased out of there. He was put on trial in the United States, but the jury deliberated 8 minutes and found him not guilty. Because a lot of Americans, by this point, 1850s, a lot of Southerners especially are looking for land to expand to. So these folks are kind of heroic. Then he goes to Nicaragua, of all places. And he establishes a republic there. So this is the flag of Nicaragua under William Walker. He's there for about a year or so, and then he's chased out. And these guys just don't know when to quit, literally. He keeps going back. In his final effort, it was in 1860, he landed in Honduras. Other Central American nations had come together to get rid of him. So when he got to Honduras, they already knew him because they'd already fought him. And so they arrested him, they put him on trial. They put him on trial for piracy and for filibustering. They found him guilty and they executed him. He was shot and killed, and he's buried in Honduras. So he was an American citizen trying to make Nicaragua part of the United States. He was an attorney. I'll give him credit. At his trial, he said, "You can't find me guilty." He said, "I'm not a pirate. I've never done anything at sea. Piracy," he said, "I've done a lot on land, but I'm not a pirate." And he said, "Filibustering is a made-up word. It's not legal. There's no legal definition of filibustering." But they didn't care for his argument, so found guilty and executed. And then one other failure, which ties into our world today with Cuba in the news, off and on. So Cuba, the United States has had its eye on Cuba for a long time. If you hear President Trump talking about us invading and doing whatever, like for Cubans, this is old news. So back in the mid-1800s, several things. President Polk had actually tried to buy Cuba. So President Polk offered $100 million to Spain for Cuba. And Spain said, "We would rather sink it to the bottom of the sea than give it up." So by this time, Spain has almost nothing left. Cuba was the pearl of the Antilles, the last of their empire, so they literally were going to hang on forever. So the United States tries to buy it, no. Franklin Pierce in the 1850s offers $130 million. Spain again says no. But then the United States diplomats in Europe, our ambassador to Great Britain and to France and to Spain, they meet in Ostend, Belgium, and they create a document that gets leaked to the press, the Ostend Doctrine, as it's called, where basically the United States says that it's our right to take Cuba. Cuba should naturally be a part of the United States, and if we want to take it, we have every right to do that. So it was embarrassing when that was leaked to the press. This is James Buchanan, who was the ambassador to England, so he's part of this document, and then he'll be president 2 years later. You can't really read the captions, but President Buchanan he's being mugged by people, and they're basically using his words from the Ostend Doctrine. Give me your change. It's only natural that I should have it. Give me your hat. It's our right to take that from you. So in the bubbles up there, it's quotes of James Buchanan himself talking about this. Now the United States was trying to purchase Cuba, but there was another filibuster, a Venezuelan who had once fought with Simón Bolívar for independence from the Spanish, Narciso Lopez. He ended up in Cuba, and there he decided to try and help Cuba get its independence from Spain, and then decided that he felt Cuba would be better situated in the United States. So he will lead a filibuster to Cuba, which will also not turn out well. He leads several expeditions, ends up in Key West after one of the failed expeditions. Just like William Walker, he keeps going back, and finally he's going to be captured and executed. And once again, technically the United States is not okay with this, but these are the years leading up to the Civil War. So many Americans, especially Southerners, were kind of hoping this might happen. Cuba had slavery already. Cuba could be a state. Cuba is not a small island, so some Southerners looked and said that's 2 or 3 states. And that's going to help us politically. So there are failed efforts to expand the country. They're not always successes. Now the last major expansion is going to happen in 1898. And this centers around Cuba once again. Jose Marti is the great liberator in Cuba. One of these statues is in Havana, one is down in Miami. So whatever side of politics you're on, and for Cubans, he is a great figure of independence. As the 1800s wear on, Spain is hanging on ever more desperately to Cuba. And Spain really was pretty ruthless. The Cubans are fighting for their independence. Americans are hearing about this. Jose Marti came through the United States often trying to get support, money, soldiers to go and fight. He came to Ocala. Tiny bit of Ocala history. There used to be a large Cuban American population in Ocala. West 40 was Marti City. A large number of Cubans, a lot of cigar manufacturers here. The Pizer cigar store was in downtown Ocala, where the Scientology building is now. That used to be this cigar store. And then there is a historical marker in downtown Ocala about Marti City. So Jose Marti did come to Ocala as part of his recruiting and fundraising efforts. This is also the era of a very famous book, Alfred Thayer Mahan, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. By the late 1800s, most of the world has been taken over by Europe. I don't have a slide. I often show it in class. By 1900, the whole African continent, other than 2 countries, was basically controlled by Europe. They had just carved it up, and most of the other parts of the world as well. And navies were a really big part of that. And so increasingly, some Americans are looking at this and saying we need to be perhaps part of this imperialism as well. So we start expanding now off of the mainland shotgun wedding where neither one wants to be there. Well, the big event in 1898 is the Spanish-American War. And this starts to show now more of a divide amongst Americans. Again, we're divided today, but not anything new. Teddy Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy when the war breaks out. He will go join the war. So this is 1897, the year before we go to war with Spain. And he says we need a war. He's somebody who looked at the rest of the world and said, we in the U.S. are falling behind. These European powers are taking over all this land, and we need to get some of that territory. William McKinley, talking about the Philippines. And this is typical in this time period of imperialism, and whether it's in Europe or in the United States. We're not doing this for ourselves. We're the white man's burden. We're coming to help. We're going to Christianize you. We're going to civilize you. So we'd rather not do this, but we will do this to help you out. Although what do you do now? So these are some cartoons with the Philippines. So Uncle Sam and President McKinley, okay, now you've got a new baby. What are you going to do with this? So of course the war with Spain is triggered by the destruction of a U.S. naval vessel in Havana in February of 1898, the USS Maine. Most scholars would say that it blew up accidentally, but many Americans were focused on what Spain was doing in Cuba at the time. New York newspapers were very good at agitating people, and so the headlines basically just assumed that the USS Maine had been blown up by the Spanish, so we needed to do something about it. President McKinley wasn't really eager to go to war, but this is, all the publicity a couple months, after the actual destruction of the USS Maine. The United States does declare war, April of 1898. And this will just show the complete collapse of what had once been Spain's empire. And this is a war not only fought here in the Caribbean over Cuba, but also in the Pacific. So Spain still controlled the Philippines. And just weeks after war is declared, we destroy the Spanish Navy in Manila Bay. So they're just knocked out there. Then we invade Cuba very easily, take care of that. We go on to Guam out in the Pacific, and then on to Puerto Rico. So war was declared in April, and in August, basically, it's all over. And so Spain loses a lot of its territory. Now, Jose Marti, when he had come to the United States, he was a smart man. He always asked the United States for help in freeing Cuba. But he said, please don't take over. We want to be free. We don't want you to replace Spain. So Congress actually passed a measure as the war was progressing that said we will not take over. The United States will not take over Cuba. But nobody thought to add to that, we're not going to take over Puerto Rico or Guam or the Philippines. So we come out of the War of 1898, Spanish-American War, with those three territories. I always say you probably don't wake up at night and say, how did we get Puerto Rico? Well, 1898. The United States got Puerto Rico and Guam. And we tried to get the Philippines. And this is a little known part of American history. We fought a bloody war for a number of years in the Philippines. The Philippines had been fighting for their independence for years, just like the Cubans had. So they were not interested in a new imperial power. So it was a vicious war on both sides, waterboarding, like torture, what we now acknowledge as torture, like both sides waterboarding each other. And lots of people killed, until the United States finally said, okay, we're not going to try and have the Philippines. But we do keep Puerto Rico and Guam. And again, now the United States is becoming an imperial power, 1898. So some of the cartoons kind of illustrating this. Uncle Sam, here's some of the new territory. So you have unruly, dark-skinned children, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Cuba. So the classroom, African Americans are in the classroom, but they're not being treated equally, so they're really not part of the class. Native Americans are here, but they've got their book upside down because they're backwards. At the door you have a Chinese. This is the era of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So this was, the United States had banned Chinese immigrants for decades. I'll skip that. This is, Teddy Roosevelt will run for vice president with William McKinley in 1900. This may be the busiest campaign ad in history. But the slogan, the American flag has not been planted in foreign soil to acquire more territory, but for humanity's sake. So we haven't taken Cuba and the Philippines and Guam for ourselves. We're helping humanity. And once again, that would have been what Europeans were saying. We haven't taken over Africa and Southeast Asia and Australia for ourselves. We're doing it to help all these people. So President McKinley, Roosevelt, other politicians are very much for this. But there is a divide. 1898, almost immediately, there is an anti-imperialist league that is created. So other Americans say, hold on a second, this is not who we are. And I read a book a few years ago about many Europeans had actually looked at the United States as their countries were becoming imperial powers, and they said, thankfully there's one country that's different. Thankfully the United States doesn't do this, and they were so frustrated when the United States suddenly became an imperial power, and they're just, we can't believe they've done it. So you see some famous names there. Jane Addams, who had helped create the Settlement House movement, Andrew Carnegie, former President Grover Cleveland, Mark Twain, William Jennings Bryan, many oftentimes U.S. presidential candidates. One of the concerns of the anti-imperialists was, up until this point in American history, whenever we took over new land, that land became a territory, and it was on a path to eventual statehood. But these folks realized Guam is never going to be a state. Puerto Rico is not going to be a state. So we are becoming an imperial power, but in 1776, we fought against representation or taxation without representation. So is this something we should be doing? Our friend Mark Twain again. There are many humorous things in the world, among them the white man's notion that he is less savage than the other savages. So Mark Twain, he wrote an essay to the person sitting in darkness, as only he could have done. His view of all this: we robbed a trusting friend of his land and his liberty. We have debauched America's honor and blackened her face before the world, but each detail was for the best. We know this. Give yourself no uneasiness. It is all right. So he's obviously mocking the imperialists. He actually came up with a flag too, which he said this should be our imperialist flag. So he took the United States flag, and what he did, he took away the stars and put the skull and crossbone, and he took away the white and put black. And he just said this is what, who we are becoming. Now again, this is a different world. The people, the McKinleys and Roosevelts just said, hey, the world has changed and we have to be a power. If not, we're going to be trampled. We have to keep up. I didn't fill that in. Maybe we can have a discussion. Obviously, our current administration has talked about making Canada a state, taking Greenland. I guess I'm not sure with Cuba. I think that's I know that's next after Iran, but not sure exactly what, if we're just going to make them free or independent. I think Venezuela is safe, although I know he said he may go run for president in Venezuela, but I don't think they're going to be a state. So, but again, that's not new. 1876, that poem. Maybe Canada and Cuba can become states. But I would point out, like, as whatever the United States might do in Cuba, and I would say the Cuban people deserve independence because they really have never had it. The Spanish took them over. After the War of 1898, we did not take over Cuba, but we were basically running things to the point, at one point in the early 1900s, we forced Cuba to put in their constitution that if the United States felt they were not doing what we believed they should, then we had a right to send our military. So if you can imagine that in the U.S. Constitution, that like if the Bahamas or Mexico don't like what we're doing, they have a right to come at any point and intervene. So Cuba has never really been truly independent. A lot of military dictators, then the Castro brothers took over. At some point, hopefully they'll actually get independence. I throw this up there too, and in 2026 we're not a huge imperial power, but we do have a number of territories around the world. Puerto Rico is the largest population-wise, well over 3 million people in Puerto Rico. Guam we still have. So Puerto Rico and Guam we got from the 1898 war with Spain. The Virgin Islands, most of the others we purchased from European powers. And if you're born in these places, the top four, you are a U.S. citizen, although you're not voting for president. You don't have official representation in Congress. American Samoa, for whatever reason, you're a U.S. national. You're not even a citizen. And I do always point out, I would assume, I can't assume. I would say other administrations, like if American Samoans said, we want to be independent, I doubt many people in Washington would say no. Or if the Northern Mariana Islands, if they said we'd like to be our own country, I don't think most American citizens would probably be, I didn't know we owned that. So I suspect, like, if any of these folks wanted to be independent, they probably would be allowed to go. But they are areas that, we control as a nation that don't have full citizenship rights. They're voting on taxes in their local territories, but they don't have a say in the U.S. Presidency. But the world has changed. 250 years is a long time. And those who advocate the U.S. being part of, not being separate, not being isolationist, which we really were as a nation until the end of World War II. We really were an isolationist nation. But post-World War II, most Americans have supported the idea that we're going to be interventionist. We're going to go and we have to sort of protect our turf and kind of maybe before something happens, make sure that we're safe. So I don't know, any thoughts on where we are as a nation? Other areas, if we have, should we have those territories? Should we get more because the world has changed? If we don't have them, China's going to take them, or Russia? Yeah, I don't know. Any thoughts or questions?
Well, is Puerto Rico, isn't there a movement for independence in Puerto Rico?
I know there have been a number of referendums in Puerto Rico. I think the last one actually voted for statehood. But I think there were a lot of internal politics there, so I don't think the turnout was really high. I believe the one before that, the majority said we're okay being a territory. Puerto Rico would be, population-wise, like the 30th largest state if it became a state. But I think we could all imagine for any of these places, like the political debates, that if Puerto Rico or Guam said we would like to become a state, Democrats and Republicans would say, all right, are you going to be a red state or a blue state? Yeah. And depending, if it was crystal clear, like, okay, it's going to be a blue state, then the other side say no statehood, and vice versa. If that's definitely a red state, then the other party would say we're going to block that. And I must say, the anti-imperialists of 1898, many of them were high-minded and said this is not who we are as a nation. But there were those who were more racist who said, well, people in Guam or the Philippines don't look like, quote unquote, us. They don't have the same culture. And we don't foresee them ever becoming a state. So we don't want any part of that. So now again, I guess my big thesis for the night, if we can take heart, these divisions, what we're going through right now, again, not anything new. The issues are new, and the politicians are new, and the podcasting and all those people are new. But the fact that we've argued and as a nation and debate, maybe we can be very, well, we should be very happy we're in a place where we can debate. If we were, tell my students, if you want to take a sign and go downtown and say whatever, people may honk at you and give you a thumbs up or give you another finger, but you can do it. And nobody's going to come arrest you. But if you want to go to Havana and try that, or go to China or go to Russia, you're not going to be out there very long before you're arrested, and you're never going to be seen again. So that's one positive. We can talk and we can debate. And I'm one that, we're just in one of those times the extremes get so much attention. I don't think the people on the farthest right are fascists or hate America. They just have a vision for America that's one certain way. And people on the left, for me, are not communists, and they don't hate America. They just have a different vision for the United States. But once again, as I said early tonight, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, most Americans see the Constitution as almost a divine document. But the Anti-Federalists are like, we don't like that thing. And maybe you need a Bill of Rights. And the Federalists said, we don't need a Bill of Rights. So if there hadn't been that debate, and I dare say most Americans, if you ask them about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights is what they know. I have freedom of speech. I have a gun. I have freedom of religion. But that was from the people who weren't sure about this whole Constitution and what it was going to be doing. Though it was a more trusting time, it was amazing, because basically the Federalists said, okay, we'll add a Bill of Rights. Just trust us, we'll do it, but let's push this Constitution on out there. And the Anti-Federalists said, okay, we trust you. And they did eventually add it. But can you imagine that today? Like either side, yeah, I trust you. So that part, we're not quite so friendly, but still, throughout our history, we've had people at each other's throats. The three branches of government, are equal, but they're always a little bit out of balance, and sometimes the president or Congress or the Supreme Court is more powerful, or sometimes it's less, and that's all normal. But hopefully, just as President Jefferson admitted, I've stretched the Constitution, but it didn't break. The hope for another 250 years and longer that we'll keep stretching and testing the limits, but as long as it doesn't break and everybody eventually respects it, that would be a good thing. Yeah, other questions or thoughts? Yeah.
I just remember teachers talking about robber barons back at the turn of the 1800s. How would they compare to what we're hearing people talk about the oligarchs today? Was big money?
Mr. Musk, Mr. Gates. No, it's a good question. In today's money, I know Rockefeller and Carnegie would have probably been wealthier even than Mr. Musk. Although I guess when SpaceX goes public
First trillion.
tomorrow, yeah, that may change. The biggest difference I tend to see is that the robber barons of the 1800s tended to be philanthropic. And I know Bill Gates was criticized for a long time, years ago, when he was the world's wealthiest man, because he wasn't giving much money away. And of course, he and his now ex-wife went in the whole different direction. So they created the foundation that's literally going to give away all their money. And I think I just saw a few months ago, he said he's going to speed that up and try and give it away quicker. But I think what I tend to read is that they may have been ruthless, but the 1800s folks tended to also feel like they had a duty to society as a whole, and often gave a lot of their money to different causes. And so some criticism of the new wave is that they may not be doing that. And hopefully they may change their mind later, and like Bill Gates, and decide to give money away.
But isn't that also,
Yeah.
they established institutions that lasted forever?
Oh,
The Rockefellers,
oh, yeah.
this is Chicago, and the
Yep.
Carnegies with libraries. We don't see that now.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that idea of the greater good was there in the 1800s. And they are my students, I give them I say that I ask my students, are they robber barons or are they captains of industry? Because they didn't pay income tax, but there was no income tax back then. So today, a lot of big companies and people don't pay it, but they figured out the loopholes. Although, can you criticize them for that? When President Trump's tax returns were finally leaked, and he didn't pay a lot of taxes most years, but nobody really cared, because he said, my accountants use the legal, all the loopholes. So yeah, I think that back then there seemed to be more broadly, okay, I have a duty to society, and I need to try and help do things for the greater good. So certainly critics today, I think broadly feel like that's been lost. So we do have, the Stanford and Vanderbilt and Chicago, University of Chicago, so many, Duke, so many of the schools that were established, and to their credit, Andrew Carnegie's advice: spend a third of your life getting educated, a third of your life making money, and a third of your life giving that money away. And he gave a lot of it away, and so did the Rockefellers. And a lot of the families don't have that money anymore. Rockefellers do, but and they continue to give away a lot of money. I think it was one of the grandchildren of David or John Rockefeller, who died a few years ago, and just the charity auction of his stuff raised almost $1 billion just for their foundation. Yeah, good question. Yeah, other thoughts or questions? Yes, sir.
I'm guessing pretty much every one of those territories that says Pacific Ocean, maybe besides Guam, was a World War II military base.
Yeah, and then the coaling station back in the that era of the sea power. Yeah. Yeah, so most of those were just for the Navy, so you didn't have to rely on an ally to give you coal to refuel. So this way we made sure we had territory for all those. I'm not sure, I know with the sea levels rising, I'm not sure where they're at. Some of those Pacific islands are kind of slowly going under, so I'm not sure how long that list will be valid. Yeah. Yeah, other thoughts, questions? All right. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you, and look forward to the celebration next month. It should be, I know I was around for the 200th. I don't think I'll be here for the 300th. So they are big anniversaries to celebrate. My dad was born on July 4th, and many of you knew him, former mayor of Ocala, and this would be his 99th birthday this year. So he always enjoyed the 4th of July, and his mom always told him the fireworks were for him when he was a kid. So I'm looking forward to the 250th. And it should be, and again, hopefully another 250 as we continue on as a nation. And keep keep debating and speaking out, whatever side of issues you're on, and again, take advantage of that. And one positive of the last few elections, we have had higher voter turnout than in recent times. They, back in the late 1800s, it was 80% or higher a lot of times. So that, with that, late 1800s, just with the Gilded Age, that was part of a shift in American society. The early ideal for the founding fathers was, you could have your wealth but not show it off. And for better or for worse, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, they started building those mansions and just said, hey, we're going to flaunt this. And we're going to let people know we have money, and we're not going to be ashamed of it. And so that just kind of, as the country grew, some people, they were very giving, but they also wanted to outdo each other with their houses and even with their giving.
They're still doing that.
Yeah. So they're still doing that, but then not, maybe for many of them, not quite as conscious of other people. And once again, Bill Gates, to his credit, his foundation, he's also tried to encourage other billionaires to give their money away.
We've done a lot for children in the world.
Yeah.
Let you know if I get any.
Yeah, no, yeah. Let us know if you get some money. I think he's having a bad week with his testifying before Congress, but
Epstein is not his friend.
yeah. All right. Oh, thank you all. Thank you.